Before we get into today's stories, never miss an update by signing up for the Dread Weekly newsletter on dreadsarmy.com. The link is in the description too. Get the latest encounters, trail camera footage, and news in your inbox once a week. Now, let's get to the stories. I work in a specialized branch of government, not the kind that gets much public attention, but nonetheless important. I worked in a department dedicated to keeping track of potentially unexplained phenomena in national parks. My job was primarily desk-bound, tucked away in a corner of an office filled with white noise and the gentle hum of old computers. My work wasn't what you'd call thrilling. It involved sifting through incident reports, identifying patterns, and sometimes cross-referencing them with historical data. But over time, I started noticing a unique pattern. Incidents that couldn't be categorized easily. Incidents that kept me awake late into the night poring over maps and files. Incidents involving a certain creature. One incident stands out in particular. It started off as a routine report from a park ranger at one of our major parks. They had come across signs of an unusually large animal and some possible damage to trees and rocks in a remote area of the park. A few weeks later, a box of documents surfaced in our department, unclaimed and with no sender's address. The contents were immediately intriguing. Included were reports from park rangers, wildlife trackers, and even a couple of hunters. The documents spanned over 2 decades, but all seemed to describe encounters with the same type of creature. The unmarked box was nothing extraordinary, just a standard shipping carton. Yet, what lay inside was a labyrinth of accounts, some typed out on old typewriter paper, others hastily written in shaky handwriting. The dates varied, the oldest document dating back to the mid-80s. What stood out was the meticulous documentation detailed sketches, longitude and latitude coordinates, and even bits and pieces of what appeared to be fur or hair samples taped onto some pages. The box seemed to contain a lifetime's worth of observations and data on this singular, mysterious creature. As I started cross-referencing the sightings and notes, a few details began to repeat across the board. Reports described a creature standing between 7 to 9 feet tall. It had a body that would put even a professional bodybuilder to shame, with wide shoulders and a broad chest. There were some discrepancies in descriptions of the creature's legs, with some stating they resembled a dog's while others argued they looked uncannily human. Its face seemed to be a grotesque amalgamation of features. The creature reportedly bore a broad snout akin to a German shepherd, with a double row of teeth that could be spotted when it growled or snarled. One particularly vivid account likened its facial structure to a demonic-looking hyena. The creature seemed to dwell in areas that are dense and remote, places where foot traffic is rare. Sightings were spread across multiple national parks, spanning from dense woodlands in the Pacific Northwest to the arid, hilly regions of the Southwest. The document suggested that it preferred the cover of the forest, but it wasn't shy of rocky terrain either. Apart from visuals, other details in the documents gave insights about its olfactory presence. People who came across the creature described an overpowering smell, a horrid combination of a wet dog, rotting meat, and something sulfuric. The smell of the creature seemed to be another common thread across the reports. People described it as something between a wet dog that had just come in from the rain and the overpowering stench of rotting meat left out in the sun for days. But the most curious description was the hint of sulfur, a smell more commonly associated with volcanic areas. One park ranger mentioned that the smell lingered long after the creature had apparently passed through the area. This unique combination of odors was like a signature, a calling card left behind at the scene, further cementing the identity of this unknown creature. As for the sounds, several accounts mentioned a deep guttural growl, almost akin to a low rumble, while others noted a bone-chilling howl that echoed through the wilderness, sounding nothing like typical wildlife calls. I know this might sound outlandish, but the consistency and sheer number of reports across different timelines and locations lead me to believe there's more to these accounts than just folklore or hallucinations. After completing a thorough investigation of the contents of the box, I felt compelled to do something more. I could no longer sit back and dismiss these as mere campfire stories or figments of overactive imaginations. The overwhelming consistency and vivid detail across the accounts suggested that this was something that required serious attention. I decided to take matters into my own hands and reached out to some trusted colleagues in my former department. Though met with initial skepticism, the evidence I shared gradually sparked interest. We formed a small team, a sort of unofficial task force, and started planning expeditions to investigate these reports further. Our first trip took us to the Pacific Northwest, where a cluster of recent sightings had been documented. Armed with maps, the detailed accounts from the box, and a sense of uneasy anticipation, we set off into the dense forest. It's been a year since that first expedition. We've had our share of unexplained phenomena, eerie sounds in the darkness, and traces of an inexplicably large creature. Though we haven't come face to face with the creature yet, we've collected enough evidence to believe we're on the right path. This journey has taken us to the edges of reason and scientific understanding. It's become more than just an investigation. It's a quest for truth, to understand what lurks in the shadows of our wild spaces. We're taking every precaution, realizing that this creature, whatever it may be, is better adapted to this environment than we are. We're not sure what lies ahead, but the pursuit of truth drives us forward. If there is something out there, we are determined to find it, to understand it, and hopefully to coexist with it. Until then, the creature from the box remains an enigma, a shadow in the wilderness that continues to captivate and terrify us. I'm an avid hiker, and I used to do a lot of hiking alone. I don't as much anymore, especially after the encounter I had. It actually has changed my behavior a lot. I'm much more careful now. And actually, I now carry a gun. Guns are kind of a disputed thing in the hiking community. Some people say that if you're smart and follow the guidelines, you'll never need one. Others say that it doesn't hurt. And others say that you should always have one because bears and mountain lions don't care about the guidelines. I've always carried bear spray as a precaution, but a gun is a whole different level. You see, that's the thing about life. You could live your whole life thinking and believing one thing. Like, I don't need a gun while hiking, and then something crazy happens and your whole perspective changes. Now, my perspective is I need a gun anytime I go into the woods. I suppose that my perspective on life has changed in more ways than just that as a result of this encounter. I went my whole life thinking there is nothing weird in the woods, and now I believe there is definitely something weird in the woods. I live in Northern California. When people think of California, they think of surfing and the Pacific Oceans and liberal politics. Where I come from, we don't fit that stereotype. There are no surfer dudes giving you a hang loose and voting blue. Northern California is very mountainous and fairly remote. People here are old-fashioned, and we like the traditional way of living. Now, I'm fairly young, so I have some issues with the traditional way of living. But I think there is some legitimate wisdom in a lot of it. It was my grandpa that first brought me out into the woods and made me fall in love with it. Now that I think about it, he always carried a gun. Because things are so traditional out here. There are a lot of stories. People haven't forgotten about that footage that was on the news in the 70s. The town I live in, Grayling, is pretty far from where that footage was shot, but people talk about it nonetheless, like it happened right in their backyard. I always thought they were just stories that people told for fun. Just stories for hanging out around the fire or in the woods. Just stories to teach little kids to be careful in the woods and at night. My encounter began like any other hiking trip. It had been a long work week, so I just wanted to get out into the woods and unwind a little. Lose cell service to gain perspective, as those dumb tourist t-shirts say. My plan was to drive a few hours out to a nearby canyon, hike out a few miles, and then pitch a tent. I was by myself and planned to just spend some time by myself, thinking and relaxing. The canyon is called Big Pine Canyon. because it's relatively wide and has a flat forested floor. It's a great camping spot, but not well known. The locals have managed to keep it a secret, so there are basically no tourists that know about it. I parked the truck and hiked out, and it was relatively uneventful. I took my time enjoying the remoteness of the valley. I didn't see a single other person, and there were no other cars in the trailhead lot. I pitched my camp, made a fire, and went to bed. It was peaceful and eventful, until the next day, which had enough eventfulness for a lifetime. From the second I woke up, things were anything but peaceful. That's because I woke up to a knocking sound, like something was hitting a tree trunk with a big stick. Normally, I'd write this off as random forest noise. Weird things happen in the woods and they come with weird noises. Some degree of weird noises is normal, but this knocking was consistent, happening every few minutes. It was also rhythmic, making it seem very, very intentional. It wasn't just a branch breaking and it was too loud to be a woodpecker. The knocking alone was honestly quite eerie. It would last for a few seconds and stop, and then it would pick up again a few minutes later and stop. I started to pack up my 10 sleeping bag. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew I didn't think I wanted to encounter it. I was on the trail back and the knocking didn't stop. It actually seemed like it was following me. I was hiking as fast as I could, basically running, and something was in pursuit of me, making sure that I knew that it was following me because it kept on knocking. I kept checking the trail behind me, trying to see what was making the sound. Towards the end of the trail, you come out of the woods and into a wide plain full of native grasses. From this point, it's only about a mile to the trailhead. I broke through the tree line and was in this grassy, flat area when I finally caught a glimpse of it. I was checking over my shoulder again when I saw a big shadow just inside the tree line. It was huge, probably 9 feet tall. It was in the shape of a man standing on 2 legs, but it was far too big to be a man. It had a long, thick branch in its right hand. I watched as it held it above its head and started banging against the tree branches above its head. When it started knocking, I started sprinting for the car. Up until this point, I had just been hiking fast. Now I was running in my heavy hiking boots, trying not to trip on the uneven dirt trail. I didn't check over my shoulder as I ran, but I could hear it knocking, warning me to get out of its valley. I have not gone back to Big Pine Canyon since then. Something else lives there, and obviously I was trespassing. It gave me a warning to get out. I'm not going to test its patience. I am writing this journal entry in response to the strange events of the last couple of nights. I am not sure what I have seen these past few nights, but they are extraordinary nonetheless. 3 weeks ago, I decided to make a solo backpacking trip into the heart of the Adirondack wilderness. I stayed away from the trails because I wanted to get more in touch with nature. It was supposed to be a healing journey, which my therapist said I should do. Boy, I bet he won't believe what I will tell them our next session. He will probably give me a one-way ticket to the mental health ward. However, I know what I saw, and it wasn't of this earth. I planned to backpack into the wilderness of the High Peaks region. I waited until after the close of deer season to avoid any hunters potentially mistaking me for a deer. After all, it has been known to happen. Since the season ends around the second week of December, I knew I needed to be prepared for the cold winter and snow. I would bring along a sled to help bring in all my supplies, such as a hot tent, stove, and other supplies. I parked at a public parking lot with a note indicating where I would be in case of an emergency. From there, I made the arduous journey into the heart of the wilderness. Progress was slowed by downed trees that seemed to grab at my sled at every turn. However, I strove onward. I stopped a couple of hours before nightfall to set up camp and cut some firewood for the night. I knew I wanted to get further in so I could relax. The first night was relatively uneventful. I made a cup of hot chocolate while I stared at the clear sky. The beautiful aspect of the wilderness is you don't have to deal with light pollution. You get to see all of the stars in their glory. Now and then, you see planes in the sky, but for the most part, the night sky is unmolested by man. At one point, I saw a blip of a light zoom quickly across the sky. I figured it was a satellite or some comet. Eventually, the cold night forced me into the warm tent, and from there I drifted off to sleep. The next day I moved deeper into the wilderness. An uneventful day as I slowly made my way deeper into the woods. Once I found a suitable location to camp at for the next few days, I quickly went to work getting everything ready. Within 2 hours, I had enough wood to last a few days. Then I began to relax as the sun started to set finally. Again, I enjoyed a cup of hot chocolate as I enjoyed the view of the night sky. After about a half hour, something seemed weird. I noticed a light that I assumed was a jet or plane. It seemed normal at first, but then it changed direction every few seconds. Then it came to a complete stop in midair before going in reverse. This was incredibly odd because I knew that this was no ordinary plane. Maybe it was some sort of new prototype tested by the Air Force. Either way, I felt uncomfortable for some reason. This lasted for about 10 minutes. Afterward, I went to bed, which was the end of that night. The third day was freezing, so I stayed in camp most of the day. I read a little bit here and there. Mostly, I kept the fire going in the stove and napped. I ate a late dinner and decided to call it an early night. Around midnight, I was awoken by a blinding light. I was so disoriented that I didn't know what to think. At first, I thought someone was shining a spotlight on my tent. Then I realized that the light was coming from above rather than from the ground. Then my mind began to race. My only explanation was a helicopter must have spotted me and decided to use me as a practice dummy. When I unzipped the tent to look outside, the light was instantly gone, and it was completely quiet. There should have been the sound of a helicopter at least flying away, but there wasn't anything. I became scared and immediately grabbed my hatchet. I couldn't sleep at all the rest of the night. There was something odd about the light as well. It seemed to pulse with different hues of light now that I reflect on what happened. It almost seemed alive, but that didn't make any sense. I decided that I would start heading out at the first light. I knew I had another night of camping before I could make it out of here, but I wanted to put some distance between me and whatever I dealt with last night. I skipped lunch to get more miles in before I had to set up camp, and I hiked a good distance. I felt more at ease for the night knowing I had put a large distance in. I enjoyed my dinner before I headed to bed. I wanted to get up early to get out of the wilderness by noon. Around midnight, it happened again. I was awoken again by a blinding light, but it seemed more intense this time, as if it was closer. I heard a metallic hum that grew louder as the light beam intensified. I was so scared by what was happening, I didn't even worry about my boots as I quickly unzipped the tent. What I saw next left me dumbfounded. Maybe 100 feet above me was a circular object that emitted light in its center. Other lights emitted from the sides danced across the surrounding area and constantly changed colors. The light in the center went out second after I was outside the tent. There appeared to be a glass window from which I could see the silhouette of two people. Except I don't know if they were people. They were tall and skinny, but there was something about the shape of their heads. They looked long and cylindrical. I knew that image would stay with me forever. The whole thing only lasted about 2 minutes. Once I saw the pilots, the object they were in began to ascend quickly. Within a few seconds, it had disappeared into the night sky. I quickly packed up camp and followed my previous trail out of the woods in the dark. I arrived in the parking lot exhausted and freaked out still. I didn't waste time getting home, speeding most of the way. I'm afraid this isn't the last I will see of that aircraft, which scares me the most. My name is James and I'm from Maine. I was in the remote wilderness of Alaska, chasing the elusive northern lights for a work project. I'd been in the wild many times, but this particular night in February was different. Originally, I'm a city boy from Boston. Growing up, I was surrounded by concrete and skyscrapers, and my only exposure to nature was through books and the occasional school trip to the zoo. It was during one such visit, while watching a nature documentary in the zoo's theater, that I was first captivated by the wild. Intrigued by the vast landscapes and the mesmerizing fauna, I started taking pictures with my old film camera, capturing the pigeons and squirrels of city parks. Over time, the local critters weren't enough for me, so after high school, I decided to major in wildlife biology, hoping it would give me the opportunity to venture into the wild. Upon graduation, I landed a job as a wildlife photographer with a renowned magazine. I traveled to rainforests, savannas, and coral reefs, capturing the beauty of the world through my lens. I've always had an affinity for the harsh but stunning landscapes of the colder regions, so when the chance to photograph the northern lights presented itself, I grabbed it eagerly. I'd spent the evening setting up my gear for the perfect shot, when an overwhelming, repugnant smell hit me like rotting meat and wet dog. It was strange and out of place. Throughout my travels, I've experienced a whole range of different smells and sounds that the wilderness has to offer. There's the fresh, earthy scent of a rainforest after a heavy downpour, the salty aroma of the ocean breeze on a coastal cliff. I've come across carcasses in the wild, remnants of a predator's meal or the unfortunate result of an illness or accident. The smell of decay is potent and unappealing, but this was different. It was more complex, layered with an undertone of wet dog and something vaguely sulfuric. And the sounds. The growl that night was unlike anything. It wasn't just the sound, but the sense of intent behind it. A clear, deliberate announcement of presence. I remember the shock of it, the way the growl seemed to echo around me, reverberating off the trees. My heart was hammering in my chest, the unexpected sound jolting me into a heightened state of alertness. In the wilderness, you quickly learn that out-of-place noises could signal danger. I've had run-ins with grizzlies and mountain lions, encounters that taught me the importance of respecting the wild and its inhabitants. But this was different. That's when I saw it standing at the edge of the tree line. It was roughly 8 feet tall, standing upright with wide shoulders and a large chest. It had a long snout, pointy ears, and a double row of teeth that were visible even from my distance. Its fur was a dark muddy brown. Despite its body resembling a dog's, its legs were eerily human-like. It was the eyes that held my attention the most, though. They were glowing ominously in the light of my flashlight. I remember my initial reaction was one of disbelief. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, certain that the freezing cold was playing tricks on me. But the image remained, the creature was real. Thoughts flooded my mind as I tried to comprehend what I was seeing. Could it be some kind of undiscovered species? Was I witnessing a rare genetic anomaly? Could it be a figment of my own fear and imagination, brought on by the eerie night and my isolation? The sense of dread was overwhelming, but as a photographer, my instincts kicked in. I reached for my camera. It was a complex mix of fear, curiosity, and professional determination. I remember fumbling for my camera, hands trembling from the cold. My mind was filled with questions. What was this creature? How did it come to be? Would anyone even believe me if I told them about it? I pushed my fear to the background, framing the shot, adjusting the exposure, focusing the lens. It was almost automatic. A familiar routine amidst the unfamiliar. Despite the overwhelming fear and the uncanny nature of the encounter, I couldn't resist the urge to document the creature. As I started clicking, the creature let out a guttural howl and disappeared into the trees. I could hear the rustling of branches as it moved away. Afterwards, I packed up and made a hasty retreat back to my camp. I spent the rest of the trip in a state of constant unease, and every noise in the night made my heart skip a beat. Since then, I've been wary on my trips, always watching over my shoulder. What I saw that night was something beyond ordinary, and it has changed the way I look at the wilderness forever. Supernatural sightings don't happen all at once. Sometimes it takes years for multiple stories to crop up in the same area. By then, that first story is either forgotten or criticized. It takes 2 stories to turn a bad night into something real. Suddenly, the tale of monsters in the woods becomes a little more believable. The first story needs the support of that second story to earn any merit of its own. My cousin had one of those stories. His story was the only one like it, which was unlucky for him. He told a tale of a summer day he went fishing on our local lake. The lake itself is unremarkable. It's a good size and it runs deep, but it's a lake. There aren't a lot of descriptors I could add to its appearance that you haven't already imagined. In my cousin's story, of course, the lake was remarkable. In fact, it was downright exceptional, but I'm getting ahead of myself. On this day, he was fishing out on that lake on his little boat just as he'd done every summer since he could cast a line. Only this time, he didn't catch anything. Quite the opposite, actually. Something caught him. He felt the boat lurch and stumble forward. He thought it was something pulling on his fishing rod. He tried to steady himself and gripped its handle like an iron vise. Only it wasn't the pole pulling him forward. It was the boat. Something was underneath the boat and had bumped it so hard that the vessel had jumped forward and completely disoriented my cousin. He leaned over to peer over the edge but could only catch a quick glimpse of a large gray shape disappearing into the depths. He stared a long time to see if it would come back up. It was bigger than any fish he'd ever heard of, and he said it was so much bigger that it could have cracked his boat in two if it tried. That story on its own didn't amount to much. You need two stories, remember? You need that second story so you can say I told you so. I'm sure you've experienced the same type of moment yourself. Someone comes back to you humbled to let you know that you were right about something. And now they want your advice even though it was once good for nothing. In this example, I was the one who wound up in that position. I didn't believe my cousin. Then I saw the shape for myself. I saw it break the water. I saw it climb taller than any fish has any right to be. Then I saw it crash back down and disappear into the lake. Unlike my cousin, I wasn't fishing at the time. I was reading. I like to go out near the shore, soak in the cool breeze, and burn through a few dozen pages of a book. The sound of the water breaking ruined that for me. I heard the surface of the lake break and my eyes jumped to the source. Someone else was out there, I thought. Someone had to be. What were the odds that I was the only person watching at that moment, with so many houses speckled around the lake? What I saw was a huge, scaly fish body. It jumped clean out of the water, catching a bird in its hands. That was the problem, right? I was looking at something my brain called a fish, but I could see human limbs as clear as day. I could see the torso of a man. I could see his fingers wrap around the bird's body. I even thought I saw him smile some wide-mouthed smile. Every animal is glad to catch its prey, right? I guess this thing was no different. The only issue was, from the waist down, the man I was looking at had a tail. It was long and thick, round like a tree trunk. Just like my cousin said, the thing was massive. It was long, and then it was gone as quickly as it had arrived. It made a huge splash. The water shimmered white with the impact, and then the bird and the thing from the lake disappeared. That made my story the second story. I was now the second person to get laughed at talking about the creature hiding in our lake. However, there was one person I was confident I could talk to, my cousin. But when I told him what I'd seen, he laughed too. You see, normally two stories with shared details validate little pieces of each other. They create a truth. But every once in a while, one of those stories is so outlandish that none of the details can even be considered to be true. I don't blame him for reacting that way. I just wish someone believed me. And I wish they'd stop going out onto that lake, because sooner or later, those scaled hands won't be reaching for feathered prey. You've been out on a lake, haven't you? You felt those phantom lurches beneath the water and chalked it up to a weird collision with the current or the wake. You've blamed the driver's skill or the unpredictability of the weather. But I've seen something in our waters. There could be something in your waters too. You might peer over the edge and only see the blur, or you might look down and see what I saw. You might see the man with the fishtail body. You might see the smile as wide as a catfish's mouth with teeth as sharp as nails. And then if you get to tell that story to someone, you'll be lucky if they laugh at you. I guess that's what I am, right? I'm lucky that I was only beside the lake instead of on top of it. Otherwise, I could have been the bird that day, and I would still think my cousin was a liar.